Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Easy Rider. This came out in 1969 and it was directed by Dennis Hopper. It's a film that in many ways captured the zeitgeist of the 1960s with the rise of the counterculture era and the hippie movement. It was just a movie that really resonated with the younger generation at the time. The free-spirited flower child, basically. Somebody who had a different philosophy and mindset that wasn't nearly as pandered to in the mainstream. Hollywood was just seen as the big bad establishment, and they were, and still are, quite frankly, making movies that were just really out of touch. They were pushing a lot of nostalgic callbacks to the golden age of Hollywood. So movies were getting the notoriety like Hello Dolly and True Grit, and the younger people just did not want that. But I do get kind of annoyed when I see like think pieces and reviews on Easy Rider that are current, where they're saying that nothing was being made for the hippies, nothing was being made like this at the time, and I kind of disagree with that. I think there were plenty of interesting films in the 1960s that were being made on the outskirts of Hollywood and beyond that really spoke to people. But I will say at the same time that there is something about Easy Rider that just feels very immersive and very simple and authentic to the period, with a lot of the, as I said, kind of the hippie mentality and a lot of these existential themes that deal with, death and morality and how all of that represents America. Not the idealized America, an America that is much more true to the way that a lot of the younger generation saw it as. Lots of political and social overtones that make a lot of those points apparent throughout the film, but I think that another reason the film does work is because it was conceived by two rebels. It was conceived by Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. Two men who were certainly a part of the Hollywood scene in a sense, but two people that were very different at the same time. They were kind of outsiders. They understood and embodied the psychedelic mindset. They were just relentless. They had a vision about the world that they thought needed to be communicated in this specific way that just wasn't being done that much in the mainstream. And I will say the end result to me is a surprisingly mature piece for the most part, and it's wise beyond its years. And yeah, it does have that very zeitgeisty feel with lots of very popular songs at the time that are constantly playing throughout the film. And, it is that classic low-budget road trip movie, but it really has dimension to it. Of course, this is, as I mentioned before, a big commentary on America or the American dream, kind of the romanticism of that idea, and a lot of the things that go on underneath that. So a lot of the anger, the duplicity, the bigotry that we see kind of beneath the surface of that system that people are so readily willing to abide by like slaves. Most people will do anything to fit in, will do what they're told, and they do it without questioning anything, without questioning true morality, the reality behind this so-called American dream and what it really means in the big context of things. You have two guys, Wyatt and Billy, in the film, and they complete a drug deal in California, and they decide to ride their Harleys all the way to New Orleans as a sort of finishing touch and as a way to sort of find themselves. So it is definitely kind of one of those existential quest movies. I love road trips, and I love road trips, what they can mean in a sort of narrative sense, as a symbol, because, I think that road trips have a kind of strange effect on the mind, on a person. At least they do for me. It feels kind of like a purgatory of sorts. You've got nothing but an open road in front of you. You have no idea where you're going to end up. You have no idea what's going to happen from day to day, and you're leaving your life behind. And I think that that's kind of a powerful thing. You're in this strange sort of kind of in-between stage of not really belonging anywhere, yet looking to the next sense of fulfillment on the horizon, literally. The more that you're exposed to, the more that you see the world as it really is. You start to see the real people that are living these real lives all over the country, like in this movie. And that starts to make our singular lives feel less important, that we're just a small piece of a much bigger picture. And a lot of times the things that we think that we want and the things that we're looking for on these excursions are never discovered. And then we end up sinking into those existential questions that we're posing in the end of it. I do think that some of the American flag imagery throughout the film is a tad overwrought, especially with Wyatt. He has a leather jacket that's got the American flag on it and the motorcycle and all of that. There's just too much of it to the point where it starts to make you really conscious of all of that, and it makes it feel forced. But that being said, there are certainly parts that I think really work. Like even in the very beginning when they're completing their drug deal and they get the money and they're hiding the money in the fuel tank, which is painted with the American flag. I love that symbol because it's exactly what I just mentioned. The idea of all of these kind of shady dealings and things that are going on underneath the surface. It's all very clandestine within this country that we tend to glorify so much. I like that the hippies themselves are not glorified. Yes, there is a certain appeal, of course. There is an allure to that kind of rugged, wild sense of adventure that these two characters embody. But these two guys do, just like anybody else, struggle with their own decisions as well. And I think that's the key. I think Wyatt in particular, he always seems to be the one that is very withdrawn, always kind of contemplating things very silently. And you're never really sure what he's thinking about because he rarely opens up about it. But you just sense that there is that internal conflict within him all the way through, and you start to see that. It starts to become more apparent at the end of the film. And then you offset that with Dennis Hopper, who is insane to begin with, but he's a very boisterous character. But rewatching it this last time, I realized, he's quite insecure in himself as well. I think that's definitely a guard, a defense mechanism, because he is constantly acting very insecure, always questioning the motives of people around him. We see a generation of youth surrounding these two characters at different points of the film, and they feel quite aimless. I mean, yes, they are people that have this philosophy and they want that liberation. They want to kind of free themselves from the shackles of these traditional values that were projected onto them by the society they grew up in, and yet they are just as lost in their pursuit of that liberation as anyone else is. So there's always that twinge, there's that bitterness, that cynicism that's lingering throughout the film. Jack Nicholson comes in later to the film, and he is a highlight for me, one of the best parts of the film, and I think he works so well because he also is a rebel. He's a rebellious actor, and I like rebels. He really does perform on his own time. He's a tremendous actor, of course, everyone knows that, but you really do get to see it a lot in his earlier work. This is a guy who just did not play by anybody's rules, as I said, and he has a very eccentric quality. He's exciting to watch, and as in terms of the character he's playing, he's a character that is peculiar, but he also is sort of the wise spectator. I love the scene where he gets high for the first time and the conversation they have, not only because it's just funny, but also because I think that it's a great conversation. It's a conversation that does have a lot of the themes of the film, basically talking about social barriers and political barriers, peace or lack thereof, and the idea of governments withholding information from so many of their people so that they really are never in control of their own lives. And these are typical conversations you do have under the influence, obviously, but I think that it's a conversation that has merit. But that's what I like. I like all the psychedelic aspects of this film because there's quite a lot of it. Definitely touches throughout. And I'm using this word very strategically, but it is very much laced with that psychedelic filter. The idea of time being a little bit relative and not quite making sense in the big scheme of things. It has a spirituality, a cosmic quality. When you're under the influence of a psychedelic, time is never what it seems. The idea of time barely exists at all to you as a concept. And they get that because the scene transitions. They do this really interesting thing where they're flickering between the current moment and the moment that's about to happen. And spoiler alert, there is a flicker, just an image, kind of midway through the film, I think, where Wyatt sees his own death. He sees the end of the film. There's a lot of the ideas of, like I mentioned, time is relative. My favorite scene, of course, is the acid trip scene that is in the graveyard at the end of the movie. And I am very picky about acid trips in movies because there have been a lot of them over the years, both in TV and in film, and just so rarely do I ever see anyone doing it right. I mean, you'll see aspects of the experience handled kind of well, but I rarely see them really doing the experience justice because it's a very, very, very hard thing to capture because it is so surreal. I have always wanted to direct like an acid trip sequence in a film. I know exactly how I would do it, but in order to do it, I would need like the best cameras, the greatest special effects team in the world, and then I might just be able to capture the essence of it. But then I think that this movie was made in the 60s on a very small budget. They didn't have the kind of special effects that we do today. They had to infer almost everything, and I think based on that, they did a really good job. There are moments leading into the trip that I think are really cool. I love the moment where they're walking and you hear all the music because Mardi Gras is going on while they're in New Orleans, and they As they kind of go away from the crowds and they go into this graveyard, you start to hear the drone of machines kind of overlapping, and it gets louder and louder until that's all you can hear. And with that drone throughout, that's when time just disbands, when they drop that acid and the perceptions of reality just disappear. And this is a very personal moment for the two main characters. It's a very introspective, very bold look within, especially Wyatt, because he again is starting to experience the weight of his mortality, and he is facing his death yet again. And anytime that if you do like an LSD trip or something, you're gonna see some scary things. You're gonna face a lot of demons, and death is a big one. You could say that they both foresee their own end because it happens very soon after. And it makes that ending, which is very abrupt, feel all the more unsettling, just because we see what happens when bigotry wins in the end, and it usually does. As far as some of the things I really don't like, I mentioned the flag imagery and how, it got a little heavy-handed for me. There's another scene where Jack Nicholson says to the Dennis Hopper character that you represent freedom, and that also, anytime you have to say in a movie verbatim, you represent blah, 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 that's, yeah, that's too much. You're explaining your intent rather than inferring it, and I personally just don't like that. And while the hippies aren't necessarily glorified, I do think that many of the people that live within the cities that Billy and Wyatt are visiting, they're a tad marginalized, villainized. The scene where they walk into the restaurant and they see the conservative rednecks and they're just glaring at them like they want them to leave. That's not one of my favorite scenes, because it feels one-dimensional, and it's kind of beneath, I think, the writing when they're able to open up other parts of the film and other characters and ideas that are more complex. But I still think that it's a really good film, and an important one that has a lot of ideas in it that I personally respond to, just in terms of my own philosophy. And I like the way that it portrays America. It's something that is still very topical and very timeless watching it today. Regardless of what time period you're in, as people, we're always just teetering. We are right on the edge between life and death, it feels like. And I think this film captures the edge part of it, just being on that edge, the thrill and the weight of those risks in the end. I think it's a good movie to revisit, especially in these very trying times that we're living in. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.